I used to think if I just stayed quieter, complained less, and accepted whatever scraps of attention came my way, maybe my father would finally see me as more than just the inconvenient daughter who happened to exist alongside his precious son. But no matter how hard I tried to disappear into the background, to make myself smaller, to need less, the truth remained painfully clear. In Thomas Hartwell's eyes, I would never matter as much as my brother Cameron. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Hartwell, and growing up in the small town of Millbrook Valley, I learned early that love in our household was a finite resource, and my brother had claimed the lion's share before I even knew there was a competition. The Hartwell family lived in a modest two-story house on Elm Creek Road, where appearances mattered more than truth, and where my father's word was law, even when that law was blatantly unfair. Thomas worked as a supervisor at the local manufacturing plant, a job that gave him just enough authority to make him feel important at home. My mother, Patricia, worked part-time at the town library, a quiet woman who had long ago learned that keeping peace was easier than fighting battles she could never win. Cameron was 3 years older than me, born with the kind of easy charm that made adults smile and forgive his countless transgressions. At 17, he was the golden boy who could do no wrong, captain of the Millbrook Valley High School soccer team, popular with his classmates, and blessed with the kind of natural charisma that made people overlook his more troubling tendencies. To our father, Cameron walked on water. To me, he was the storm cloud that perpetually hovered over my existence, blocking out any chance of sunshine. The favoritism wasn't subtle. It never had been. When Cameron was 12 and broke our neighbor's window playing baseball in the yard, Dad marched over to old Mr. Henderson's house, apologized profusely, and paid for the replacement without so much as raising his voice at his son. "Boys will be boys," he said with a chuckle when he returned home. "That's how they learn boundaries." When I was 9 and accidentally knocked over a plant pot while helping Mom garden, Dad's face darkened like a thundercloud. "Elena Marie Hartwell," he barked, using my full name the way he always did when I was in trouble. "You need to start paying attention to what you're doing. This carelessness is becoming a habit." The plant cost $7. Cameron's window had cost $200. But it wasn't just about money or broken objects. It was about the fundamental difference in how we were seen, valued, and treated in our own home. Cameron could leave his dirty dishes in the sink for days, and Mom would quietly clean them up while Dad pretended not to notice. If I left so much as a single cup on the counter, I'd get a lecture about responsibility and respect for the household. Cameron could stay out until midnight without so much as a text message, and Dad would just shrug and say, "He's probably with friends." If I was 10 minutes late coming home from the library, my phone would buzz with increasingly frantic messages demanding to know my exact location. Cameron could fail a test and get a sympathetic pat on the shoulder and offers of tutoring. When I brought home a B+ on a particularly challenging math exam, my best grade in the subject all year, Dad barely looked up from his newspaper. "Math was never your strong suit anyway," he muttered. The message was always clear. Cameron was the priority, the investment, the future. I was just there. But nothing illustrated this dynamic more clearly than what happened when I turned 14 and discovered my passion for cycling. It started innocently enough. My friend Rachel Pemberton had gotten a mountain bike for her birthday, and she'd invited me to ride the trails that wound through Clearwater Park on the outskirts of town. I'd borrowed Mom's old bike, a heavy, rusty thing that she'd had since college, and discovered something magical in those winding dirt paths. For the first time in my life, I felt free. The wind in my hair, the burn in my legs as I pedaled up steep inclines, the thrill of navigating rocky terrain. It was like finding a piece of myself I didn't know was missing. Out there on those trails, I wasn't the overlooked daughter or the disappointing second child. I was just Elena, strong and capable and alive. I started riding every weekend, then after school when I could manage it. I learned the names of different trail systems, studied cycling magazines at the library, and watched YouTube videos about proper riding techniques. For the first time, I had something that was entirely mine, a passion that had nothing to do with seeking approval or competing for attention. Mom noticed my enthusiasm and quietly encouraged it. She'd pack extra snacks when I planned longer rides and always asked about my adventures when I returned home, mud-splattered and grinning. Dad, predictably, saw it as another example of my tendency toward tomboy nonsense. She should be focused on more practical things, he'd tell Mom when he thought I wasn't listening. Art classes, cooking, things that will actually be useful to her someday. But I persisted, riding Mom's ancient bike until the chain started slipping regularly and the brakes began to fail. That's when I made what I thought was a reasonable request.
It was a Saturday morning in early October, and I'd been researching bikes online for weeks. I'd found a perfect entry-level mountain bike at Henderson's Sporting Goods, a Trek model that was on sale for $350. I'd saved up $120 from babysitting jobs and odd tasks around the neighborhood, and I'd planned my approach carefully. Dad was in the garage, tinkering with his car engine, a weekend ritual that always put him in a relatively good mood. I approached nervously, clutching a printout of the bike's specifications. "Dad," I began hesitantly, "I wanted to talk to you about something." He didn't look up from the engine bay. "What is it, Elena?" "Well, you know how I've been really into cycling lately? Mom's bike is getting pretty worn out, and I found this great bike that's on sale. I've already saved up about a third of the cost, and I was wondering if there was any way you could help me with the rest, maybe as an early Christmas present or something." I held my breath, hoping that maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time he'd see how much this meant to me. Dad finally straightened up and looked at the printout I was holding. His expression was neutral as he scanned the information, and for a moment I allowed myself to hope. $350? He said finally. "Yes, sir, but I already have $120 saved, so it would only be—" "Elena, that's a lot of money for a hobby." He wiped his hands on a shop rag, his tone taking on the patient but condescending quality it always had when he was about to deliver a life lesson. "And hobbies change. Remember when you wanted to learn guitar? We bought you that instrument, and it's been sitting in your closet for 2 years. "But this is different," I protested. "I've been riding consistently for months. This isn't just a phase." He turned back to the engine. "We'll see. Maybe for your birthday next year if you're still interested." My birthday was 8 months away. That same evening, Cameron casually mentioned that his gaming setup was getting outdated and that he'd been looking at a new graphics card that cost $450. "Really?" Dad's eyes lit up with interest. "For your computer?" "Yeah, it would make such a huge difference for the games I'm playing with the team. And honestly, I'm thinking about maybe streaming some of my gameplay. Could be a way to make some money eventually." Within 10 minutes, Dad was online ordering the graphics card with overnight shipping. I watched this interaction from the kitchen doorway, something cold and hard settling in my chest. The graphics card cost $100 more than the bike I'd researched for weeks. Cameron hadn't saved a single penny toward it. He had mentioned it in passing, and within minutes, Dad was pulling out his credit card. But the graphics card was just the beginning. Over the next few months, I watched a parade of expensive purchases flow toward Cameron, while my own requests were met with lectures about fiscal responsibility and the importance of earning things for yourself. Cameron wanted new soccer cleats? Dad drove him to the sporting goods store the next day and bought him a pair that cost $200. Cameron mentioned he needed a new phone because his screen was cracked. Dad upgraded him to the latest model within the week. Cameron decided he wanted to take his girlfriend, Ashley Morrison, on a fancy date for their 6-month anniversary. Dad handed over his credit card and told him to show her a good time. Meanwhile, I continued riding Mom's deteriorating bike, watching the gears slip more frequently and feeling the brakes become increasingly unreliable. When I mentioned these safety concerns, Dad's response was always the same. That bike got your mother through college. It's got plenty of life left in it. The breaking point came in late November, 2 weeks before my 15th birthday. I'd been riding the Millbrook Ridge Trail, a challenging route that included some steep climbs and technical descents. On the way back down, going around a sharp corner, Mom's old bike finally betrayed me completely. The front brake cable snapped just as I was trying to slow down for a rocky section. I went over the handlebars and landed hard on my right shoulder, skidding across the rocky trail. By some miracle, I didn't break any bones, but I was badly scraped up and shaken. Rachel, who had been riding behind me, helped me back to town where Mom took one look at my torn clothes and bleeding elbow and drove me straight to the urgent care clinic. The doctor cleaned and bandaged my scrapes and confirmed that nothing was broken, but he was stern about the cause of the accident. These old bikes can be dangerous when they're not properly maintained, he told my parents. Brake failures like this can lead to much more serious injuries. I expected this near miss to finally convince Dad that I needed a safe, reliable bike. Instead, his response was to ban me from trail riding altogether. If you can't handle that bike safely, then maybe you shouldn't be riding trails. Stick to the neighborhood streets until you develop better judgment. I stared at him in disbelief. Dad, it wasn't my judgment that was the problem. The brake cable snapped. The bike is falling apart. Elena, I don't want to hear excuses. You need to take responsibility for your safety. That night, I lay in bed with my bandaged arm throbbing and something fundamental shifting inside me. It wasn't just anger anymore, though that was certainly there. It was a growing understanding that no amount of reasoning, pleading, or even evidence would change how my father saw me. To him, I would always be the afterthought, the one whose needs could be dismissed, whose safety could be compromised, whose dreams could be deferred indefinitely. Cameron's wants became priorities. My needs became inconveniences.
But I was done waiting for fairness. I was done hoping for equity. If Dad wouldn't help me get a safe bike, I'd find another way. I started working more babysitting jobs, picked up extra chores for neighbors, and even took on dog walking responsibilities for several families in our neighborhood. Every dollar I earned went into a small metal box I kept hidden in my closet. I researched used bikes, comparing prices and checking reviews. I learned about maintenance and repairs so I could buy something older and fix it up myself if necessary. By February, I'd saved enough to buy a decent used mountain bike from a college student who was graduating and moving to a city. It wasn't the track I'd originally wanted, but it was solid, reliable, and most importantly, mine. I'd earned every dollar of it myself. I kept the bike at Rachel's house initially, telling my parents I was borrowing it from a friend. I wanted to prove that I could ride safely and responsibly before revealing my purchase. Every weekend, Rachel and I would hit the trails together, and I fell in love with cycling all over again. The bike was freedom. It was proof that I could set a goal and achieve it without help. It was the first thing in my life that belonged entirely to me, bought with my own money and effort. I should have known Cameron would find a way to destroy it. 3 months after I bought the bike, I finally decided to bring it home. I was proud of what I'd accomplished, and part of me still hoped that Dad might be impressed by my initiative and determination. I rolled the bike into our garage one Saturday afternoon, planning to clean and tune it up before my next ride. "Where did this come from?" Dad asked when he saw me working on it. "I bought it," I said, unable to keep the pride out of my voice. "I saved up enough money from babysitting and bought it myself." For a moment, something that might have been respect flickered across his face, but then his expression hardened again. "You should have discussed this with me first. Major purchases need to be approved." "It's my money," I replied, confused. "I earned it myself." "You're still a minor living in my house," he said firmly. "And after what happened on that trail, I'm not sure you've demonstrated the maturity to make these kinds of decisions." My heart sank, but I tried to stay calm. "Dad, I've been riding safely for months. Ask Rachel's parents. They'll tell you I'm responsible." He seemed to consider this for a moment. "We'll see," he said finally. "But this bike stays in the garage when you're not riding it. I don't want it cluttering up the yard." It was a small victory, but I'd take it. At least he wasn't forbidding me from riding entirely. For 2 blissful weeks, I had my bike and my freedom. I rode almost every day after school, exploring new trails and pushing myself to improve. I felt strong, capable, and independent in a way I'd never experienced before.
Cameron, meanwhile, was dealing with his own set of problems. His grades had been slipping all semester, and Dad was finally starting to notice. Cameron's soccer season was over, which meant he had fewer distractions from his academic struggles, and the reality of his failing English and history classes was becoming impossible to ignore. "You need to get serious about school," Dad had been telling him repeatedly. "Your senior year matters for college applications." Cameron would nod and promise to do better, but nothing really changed. He was still staying out late, still spending more time on his gaming setup than on homework, still coasting on charm and natural talent that was no longer enough to carry him through. I watched this dynamic with a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. Part of me was glad that Cameron was finally facing some consequences for his choices, but I also knew how these situations usually played out in our family. Somehow, Cameron's problems would become everyone else's responsibility to solve. I just didn't realize how directly his academic troubles would affect me until that terrible Thursday afternoon in early May. I had arrived home from school to find my bike missing from the garage. My first thought was that it had been stolen, but that didn't make sense. Nothing else was disturbed, then who would break into a garage just to steal a bike? I searched the entire garage, thinking maybe Dad had moved it for some reason, but it was nowhere to be found. Cameron's car was in the driveway, so I knew he was home. I found him in his room, playing video games with his headset on. "Cameron," I said, knocking on his open door, "have you seen my bike?" He didn't look away from his screen. "What bike?" "My mountain bike. It was in the garage this morning, and now it's gone." "Oh, that." He finally glanced over at me, his expression oddly guilty. "Yeah, I borrowed it." "You borrowed it?" I felt a chill of foreboding. "Where is it?" "Well," he paused his game and turned to face me fully. "Here's the thing. I kind of had an accident with it." The bottom dropped out of my stomach. "What kind of accident?" "I was riding it over to Jake Sullivan's house, and I took a shortcut through Riverside Park. You know that steep hill that goes down to the creek? I was going pretty fast, and I guess I hit a rock or something. The bike kind of went into the water." I stared at him, not comprehending. "Into the water?" "Yeah, into Riverside Creek. And before you ask, no, I couldn't get it out. The current was stronger than I expected, and by the time I found someone to help me, it was gone." The words hit me like physical blows. My bike, the bike that I'd worked for months to afford, the bike that represented my independence and freedom, was gone, destroyed by my brother's carelessness. "Cameron," I spoke whispering, my voice shaking with rage and disbelief, "that bike cost me $350. I worked for months to save that money. Look, I'm sorry, okay? It was an accident. I didn't mean for it to happen."
Why were you even riding it? You have your own bike. Mine has a flat tire, and I didn't want to deal with fixing it. Yours was right there. The casual way he said it, as if my property was naturally available for his convenience, made my vision blur with anger. You destroyed my bike because you were too lazy to fix a flat tire? Elena, calm down. It's not that big a deal. Dad can buy you another one. It is a big deal. I was shouting now, all my usual restraint evaporating. That bike was mine. I saved for months to buy it. You had no right to take it.
"Hey, what's all the yelling about?" Dad's voice came from the hallway. I turned to see him approaching Cameron's room, his expression already showing annoyance at being disturbed. "Dad," I said, trying to control my voice, "Cameron took my bike without asking and destroyed it." Dad looked between us, his brow furrowed. "What happened?" Cameron launched into his version of events, making it sound like an innocent mistake that could have happened to anyone. He emphasized how sorry he was and how he'd tried to retrieve the bike from the creek. "It was just an accident, Dad. I feel terrible about it." I waited for Dad's response, expecting anger on my behalf, demands that Cameron replace what he destroyed, consequences for taking something that didn't belong to him. Instead, Dad sighed and shrugged. "Well, these things happen. It's unfortunate, but bikes are meant to be ridden. Wear and tear is part of ownership." I felt like I'd been slapped. "Wear and tear?" I repeated incredulously. "Dad, he destroyed my bike in a creek."
Elena, I understand you're upset, but accidents happen. Cameron didn't do it on purpose. He took it without asking. He destroyed $350 worth of my property. Lower your voice, Dad said sternly, and watch your tone. Cameron apologized, and he feels bad about what happened. Getting hysterical isn't going to solve anything. I'm not being hysterical, I'm being reasonable. If someone destroys your property, they should replace it. Life doesn't always work that way, Elena. Sometimes things get broken, and you have to accept it and move on. I looked at Dad in complete disbelief. If I had taken Cameron's gaming computer and dropped it in a creek, would his response be the same casual dismissal? If I had crashed Cameron's car, would it be chalked up to wear and tear? We all knew the answer to that question. So that's it? I asked, my voice hollow. Cameron destroys my bike and I'm just supposed to accept it? I'm not saying you have to like it, but yes, you need to accept it and move on. These things happen in families. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, something fundamental breaking inside me. It wasn't just about the bike anymore, though the loss of it felt like losing a piece of myself. It was about the message that incident had sent, that my property, my feelings, my effort meant nothing in this family. Cameron could destroy what I'd worked months to earn, and it would be dismissed as an accident. He could take what belonged to me without permission, and I'd be told to lower my voice when I protested. He could cost me hundreds of dollars through his carelessness, and Dad's response would be a shrug and a lecture about accepting life's disappointments. But I knew with absolute certainty that if the situation had been reversed, if I had destroyed something of Cameron's, the consequences would have been swift and severe. I would have been grounded, lectured, and forced to replace what I'd broken, even if it meant working for months to earn the money. The double standard wasn't just unfair, it was crushing. It told me that in my father's eyes, I was disposable, my needs negligible, my feelings irrelevant. But as I lay there in the dark, something else was growing alongside the pain and anger. A cold, determined resolve that I'd never felt before. I was done being the victim of this family's dysfunction. I was done accepting crumbs and calling them meals. I was done being treated like my brother's property was more valuable than mine, like his convenience mattered more than my hard work. I didn't know how yet, but I was going to find a way to make them see exactly what they'd lost when they chose to dismiss me. I was going to become someone they couldn't ignore, couldn't diminish, couldn't treat as less than. And when that day came, they would remember this moment. This casual destruction of something I'd worked so hard for, this dismissive response to my legitimate anger, this clear message that I didn't matter in my own family. They thought Cameron's accident was the end of the story. They had no idea it was just the beginning. The weeks following the bike incident passed in a haze of resentment and bitter acceptance. I went through the motions of normal family life, sitting through dinners where Cameron's latest achievements were celebrated, while my loss was never mentioned again, pretending to listen to Dad's weekend plans that somehow always revolved around my brother's activities, watching Mom quietly enable the dysfunction by never challenging the obvious favoritism. But inside, something was crystallizing. Every dismissive comment, every eye roll when I tried to voice my feelings, every casual assumption that I should just get over it was building towards something I couldn't yet name. I felt like a pressure cooker with a faulty valve, the steam building with nowhere to go. Cameron, for his part, seemed to have forgotten about the incident entirely. Within a week of destroying my bike, he was back to his usual routine, staying out late, playing video games, coasting through his senior year with the kind of confidence that only comes from never truly facing consequences. He never offered to help replace what he'd destroyed, never brought up the subject again, never seemed to lose a moment's sleep over the financial loss he'd caused me. That casual indifference hurt almost as much as the original destruction.
2 months after losing my bike, I'd started saving again.
Every babysitting job, every lawn I mowed, every small task I could find went toward rebuilding what Cameron had destroyed. It was slower this time. Word had gotten around the neighborhood that I was reliable. But summer jobs were competitive, and I was starting from zero again. I kept my earnings in the same metal box, hidden in my closet, counting and recounting the growing pile of bills. $50, $75, $100. Each dollar felt precious and fragile, earned through sweat and careful budgeting. I ate packed lunches instead of buying food at school, declined invitations to movies or restaurants with friends, and turned down every small luxury to funnel money toward my goal. Rachel had been incredibly supportive, letting me borrow her bike for weekend rides and never making me feel like a burden. But it wasn't the same. Riding someone else's bike was a constant reminder of what I'd lost, what had been taken from me without consequence. "You know," Rachel said one Saturday as we finished a ride through Clearwater Park, "what your brother did really sucks. I can't believe your dad just brushed it off like that." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Rachel was the only person who truly understood how devastating the loss had been, who recognized that it wasn't just about the money, but about what the bike had represented: independence, achievement, proof that I could accomplish something on my own. "Have you thought about maybe talking to your mom about it? Maybe she could convince your dad to help replace it." I had considered it, but I knew it would be futile. Mom's role in our family was to keep the peace, to smooth over conflicts rather than address their root causes. She'd offer sympathy, but wouldn't challenge Dad's decision. In our household, what Thomas Hartwell said was final, regardless of how unfair or illogical it might be. "It wouldn't matter," I said finally. "Dad's made up his mind. According to him, I need to learn to accept disappointment and move on." "That's such bullshit," Rachel said bluntly. "If Cameron had lost something that expensive, your dad would have replaced it immediately." She was right, and we both knew it. The double standard was so obvious that even my friends could see it. But knowing something is unfair and being able to change it are two very different things. The real breaking point came in late July, just as I was starting to believe I might have my bike situation figured out. I'd saved nearly $200 and found a decent used bike online that I could afford. It wasn't perfect, but it would get me back on the trails and restore some of the independence I'd lost. I was planning to buy it the following weekend, when everything fell apart in the most spectacular way possible. It started with Cameron's summer job, or rather his lack of one. While I'd been scrambling to earn money through odd jobs around the neighborhood, Cameron had spent the first month of summer vacation sleeping until noon and playing video games until the early hours of morning. Dad had made increasingly pointed comments about the importance of work experience and building character, but no actual consequences materialized. Finally, in mid-July, Dad had put his foot down. "Cameron, you need to find a job. This laziness has gone on long enough." "I've been looking," Cameron protested, though we all knew he hadn't submitted a single application. "Well, look harder. I want you employed by the end of the week." Cameron had scrambled to find something, anything, that would get Dad off his back. He'd landed a position at Morrison's Garden Center, a local nursery owned by Ashley's family. It was supposed to be perfect: easy work, friendly employers, and the added benefit of spending time near his girlfriend. But Cameron approached his job with the same entitled attitude he brought to everything else. He showed up late, took extended breaks, and generally treated the position as a minor inconvenience rather than a responsibility. Ashley's parents, the Morrisons, were patient people who valued their relationship with their daughter, but even their tolerance had limits. The breaking point came when Cameron decided to borrow a high-end electric hedge trimmer from the garden center to help with a landscaping project at Jake Sullivan's house. He'd planned to return it before anyone noticed, but the tool was damaged during the project. A crucial component had broken, rendering it essentially useless. When Mr. Morrison discovered the missing trimmer and confronted Cameron about it, my brother had initially tried to deny any knowledge of its whereabouts. Only when faced with the threat of involving the police did he admit to taking it. The trimmer was worth $800. Mr. Morrison was furious not just about the theft, but about the lies and the attempted cover-up. He fired Cameron on the spot and demanded immediate reimbursement for the damaged equipment. Ashley, mortified by her brother's behavior, had broken up with him in the garden center parking lot, while her father watched approvingly. Cameron came home that evening in a state of panic that I'd never seen before. He'd lost his job, his girlfriend, and was facing a financial obligation that dwarfed anything in his limited experience. For the first time in his life, charm and excuses weren't going to be enough to fix the mess he'd created. Dad's reaction was swift and predictable. After the initial shock and anger wore off, the focus shifted immediately to damage control. How could they fix the situation? How could they minimize the consequences? How could they protect Cameron's future from this youthful mistake? $800, Dad muttered, pacing around the living room while Cameron sat on the couch, looking appropriately contrite. "I wasn't thinking," Cameron replied, his voice small. "I just thought I could borrow it and return it before anyone noticed. I never meant for it to get damaged."
But tonight had shown me the truth. It didn't matter how hard I worked or how responsible I was. It didn't matter that I'd never stolen anything, never lied about my mistakes, never caused expensive problems for the family. In Dad's eyes, I would always be the one whose dreams could be sacrificed for Cameron's problems. Well, if that's how they wanted to play it, fine. But they were making a critical mistake if they thought I would just accept this treatment forever. I pulled out my phone and started researching. College scholarships, emancipation laws, job opportunities for minors. If my family was going to treat me like an outsider in my own family, then maybe it was time to become one officially. But first, I was going to find out exactly what happened that day Cameron accidentally destroyed my bike, because something about his story had never quite added up, and I was tired of taking his word for anything. If I was going to burn bridges, I wanted to make sure I had all the facts first. The war between me and my family was about to begin in earnest, and this time, I wasn't planning to fight fair. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I'd never felt before. The anger from the previous night had crystallized into something colder and more focused. If Dad wanted to treat me like an outsider in my own family, then I'd start acting like one. But first, I needed answers. I'd been thinking about Cameron's story of how my bike ended up in Riverside Creek, and the more I analyzed it, the less sense it made. He claimed he'd been taking a shortcut to Jake Sullivan's house through Riverside Park, but Jake lived on the opposite side of town. The park wasn't a shortcut to anywhere from our house. It was actually a significant detour. More importantly, I knew that trail. The path down to the creek wasn't steep enough or rocky enough to cause someone to lose control and crash into the water. You'd have to deliberately ride off the trail and down the embankment to end up in the creek. I'd been so devastated by the loss of my bike that I hadn't questioned his story at the time. But now, with clearer eyes and nothing left to lose, I was beginning to suspect that Cameron's accident might not have been an accident at all. That Saturday morning, I told Mom I was going to spend the day at Rachel's house. Instead, I rode Rachel's bike to Riverside Park to investigate the scene myself. I wanted to see exactly where Cameron claimed the accident had happened and whether his story held up to scrutiny. The park was quiet in the early morning, with just a few joggers and dog walkers on the main paths. I made my way to the area Cameron had described, near the steep hill that led down to the creek. Standing there, looking at the terrain, I became even more convinced that something didn't add up. The trail was wide and well-maintained, with clear sightlines in both directions. There weren't any large rocks or obstacles that could cause someone to suddenly lose control and crash into the water. You'd have to deliberately ride off the trail and down the embankment to end up in the creek. I made my way carefully down the steep slope to the creek's edge, looking for any signs of what might have happened 3 months ago. The area was overgrown with summer vegetation, but after 20 minutes of searching, I found something that made my blood run cold. Partially hidden under some fallen branches about 10 feet from the water's edge were several bike parts, a bent wheel rim,
a broken chain guard, and most damning of all, a piece of the distinctive blue frame from my Trek mountain bike. The parts weren't scattered randomly, as you'd expect from a crash. They were clustered together, hidden deliberately under debris. My bike hadn't been lost in an accident. It had been destroyed intentionally, and the evidence hidden. I sat on a large rock by the creek, staring at the bike parts and trying to process what this meant. Cameron hadn't borrowed my bike and crashed it. He'd taken it and deliberately destroyed it, then lied about what happened. But why? The answer came to me as I remembered the timeline. The bike had disappeared on a Thursday afternoon in early May. That was the same week Cameron had been panicking about his English paper, a major assignment that was worth 30% of his grade. He'd been putting it off for weeks, and the deadline was approaching fast. I also remembered that Thursday was the day Cameron was supposed to have his monthly check-in with his guidance counselor about his college applications. He'd been dreading that meeting because his grades were slipping and he had nothing positive to report. What if the bike destruction hadn't been random? What if Cameron needed a crisis, a distraction, something to shift the family's attention away from his academic failures? The more I thought about it, the more sense it made. Cameron was a master at creating diversions when he needed them. When he'd failed his driver's test twice, he'd mysteriously come down with a stomach bug the day before his third attempt, earning sympathy and an extension. When he'd been caught drinking at a party, he'd immediately confess to a smaller transgression, skipping curfew, to deflect attention from the bigger problem. Destroying my bike and creating family drama around it would have been a perfect distraction from his failing grades and college application stress. And it had worked beautifully. Dad had been so focused on managing the aftermath of the accident that Cameron's academic problems had been pushed to the back burner. I gathered up the bike parts and put them in my backpack. This was evidence, proof that Cameron had lied about what happened. But I knew that simply presenting this to Dad wouldn't accomplish anything. He'd find a way to explain it away, or he'd claim that Cameron just panicked and made up the story to avoid getting in more trouble.
No, if I was going to use this information effectively, I needed more than just evidence of Cameron's lie. I needed leverage. Over the next several days, I began what I privately called Operation Documentation. If my family was going to treat me like an outsider, then I was going to start acting like an investigative journalist rather than a naive daughter. I started paying attention to everything in a way I never had before. Cameron's schedule, his behavior patterns, his interactions with Dad. I noted when he came home, where he said he'd been, what stories he told about his activities. I documented every example of favoritism I witnessed, every double standard, every casual dismissal of my needs or feelings. Most importantly, I started recording conversations. It began almost by accident. I had been sitting in the kitchen doing homework when Dad and Cameron had a conversation in the living room about Cameron's plans to retake the SAT in the fall. I'd been taking voice notes for an English assignment on my phone when I realized I was inadvertently recording their discussion. Listening to it later, I was struck by how different Dad's tone was when talking to Cameron versus how he spoke to me. With Cameron, his voice was warm, encouraging, supportive. He talked about investments in your future and helping you reach your potential. I'd never heard him speak to me that way, ever. That gave me an idea. What if I started deliberately recording family interactions? Not to entrap anyone, but to have an objective record of how I was treated versus how Cameron was treated. Maybe having audio evidence would help me articulate what I'd been feeling but struggling to express. I became very strategic about it. I'd start voice recordings during family dinners, during car rides, during any interaction where both Cameron and I were present. My phone was always on the table or in my pocket, innocuously capturing everything. The results were even more damning than I had expected. In just 2 weeks, I had recorded Dad promising to help Cameron with his college application essays, offering to pay for an expensive SAT prep course, and agreeing to buy him a new laptop for senior year because he'd need it for college.
In that same period, when I asked if I could sign up for a photography class at the community center, Dad told me we needed to watch our spending and that I should find free ways to explore my interests. The photography class cost $60. Cameron's SAT prep course cost $800. I also captured a conversation between Mom and Dad where they discussed taking money from my savings account to cover not just Cameron's debt to Morrison's, but also some of his other expenses. Dad suggested taking an extra $200 since Elena won't need it anytime soon anyway. That conversation happened while I was supposedly asleep upstairs. They had no idea I'd crept down to listen at the top of the stairs, phone recording everything. But the most valuable recording came by pure chance during a conversation I was never supposed to hear. It was a Tuesday evening in mid-August. I had been in my room with the door closed, supposedly studying, when I heard raised voices from downstairs. Cameron had come home 2 hours past his curfew, and Dad was finally laying down the law about his summer behavior. I could hear fragments of their argument through the floor, but I couldn't make out the specific words. Curious, I crept to the top of the stairs and started recording. What I heard changed everything. "I'm tired of making excuses for you," Dad was saying, his voice angrier than I had heard in years. "The job situation, the grades, the lying, it all has to stop. I know, I've been screwing up, but I can fix this." How? By creating more diversions? By causing more problems that we have to solve for you? There was a pause, and then Cameron said something that made my blood freeze. "Look, the bike thing worked, didn't it? Elena stopped bothering you about grades and college stuff for weeks after that happened?" "Cameron, what are you talking about?" "Nothing. Forget it. I just meant that sometimes these family crises things blow over, you know?" Wait. Dad's voice had changed, become sharper. "What do you mean the bike thing worked? What exactly happened to Elena's bike?" Another pause, longer this time. "It was an accident, like I said. Maybe I wasn't trying as hard as I could have been to avoid the creek. You were so stressed about my grades and the applications, and I thought if there was some other drama to deal with." "Are you telling me you deliberately destroyed your sister's bike?" "Not deliberately destroyed. Just not trying as hard as I could have been to save it when things went wrong." Jesus Christ, Cameron. "Dad, you don't understand. The pressure was killing me. You were on my case every single day about school and applications and my future. I needed a break. I needed you to focus on something else for a while." "So, you decided to destroy something your sister had worked months to afford?" "She got over it. And it worked. You stopped hassling me about grades for the rest of the school year." The silence that followed was deafening. I sat at the top of the stairs, my phone shaking in my hands, barely believing what I'd just heard. Cameron had admitted it. He'd deliberately destroyed my bike as a calculated distraction from his own problems. The months I'd spent grieving the loss of my freedom and independence, the additional months I'd spent working to save for a replacement, all of it was the result of his selfish manipulation. But what happened next was even more shocking than Cameron's confession. "Cameron, that was incredibly selfish and irresponsible. I know, I'm sorry. I should have found another way to handle the stress. Yes, you should have, but what's done is done. We can't change it now."
I waited for the consequences, for the punishment, for some acknowledgement of the magnitude of what Cameron had done to me. "You're going to find a job this week," Dad continued, "a real job, and you're going to stick with it. No more excuses, no more drama. And we're going to have weekly check-ins about your senior year preparation." That was it. No mention of replacing my bike, no discussion of telling me the truth, no consequences related to the actual crime he'd committed. Cameron had confessed to deliberately destroying my property as part of a calculated manipulation, and Dad's response was to give him a lecture about getting a job.
I sat there for another 10 minutes, listening to them discuss Cameron's college application timeline as if nothing significant had just happened. They talked about essay topics, recommendation letters, and application deadlines. Dad's tone had already shifted back to supportive and encouraging. The bike incident was ancient history. Cameron's confession was just another piece of information to be filed away and forgotten. But not by me. That night, I uploaded all my recordings to a cloud storage account and made backup copies on a USB drive that I hid in my room. Then I sat down and created a detailed timeline of everything that had happened, cross-referencing it with my audio evidence. The picture that emerged was devastating. Cameron's confession proved that my bike's destruction had been intentional. The family financial discussions showed that my savings were being raided to cover his mistakes. The comparative treatment documented in dozens of conversations revealed a pattern of favoritism so extreme it was almost comical. But having evidence wasn't enough. I needed a plan. Over the next few weeks, I began laying the groundwork for what I privately called my independence strategy. If my family was determined to treat me as a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be respected, then I needed to position myself outside their control. I started by researching my legal options. In Pennsylvania, minors could petition for emancipation under certain circumstances, including financial independence and parental consent. While I doubted I'd get parental consent, there were other avenues to explore. I also began looking into early college admission programs, scholarship opportunities, and work-study options that could get me out of the house and into a more stable situation. My grades were excellent, and I'd been involved in several extracurricular activities that could strengthen college applications. But most importantly, I started building my own financial foundation in a way that my parents couldn't access or control. I opened a bank account at a different bank than the one my family used, using my babysitting income to establish an account that only I had access to. I researched online freelancing opportunities and started doing small graphic design projects for people I found through social media. I even started a small pet-sitting business, leveraging my reputation for reliability into a steady income stream. Everything I earned went into my secret account. I told my parents I was still saving for a replacement bike, which wasn't technically a lie. I was saving for that and much more. But they had no idea that my financial goal had expanded far beyond a single purchase. I was saving for freedom. As summer turned to fall, Cameron started his senior year with renewed focus, partly because Dad was monitoring his progress more closely, and partly because the reality of college applications was finally motivating him to take school seriously. He'd found a part-time job at a local restaurant, though he complained constantly about the hours and the work. I started my sophomore year with my own renewed focus, but mine was directed to a very different goal. I threw myself into my studies with an intensity that surprised my teachers and worried my parents. I joined the debate team, started volunteering at the animal shelter, and took on additional responsibilities wherever I could find them. To outside observers, I probably looked like a model student having a breakthrough year. But I knew what I was really doing, building a resume for escape. Every academic achievement, every leadership position, every volunteer hour was another line on future college applications. Every dollar I earned was another step toward financial independence. Every recording I made was more evidence of why I needed to get out. By October, I'd saved nearly $1,000 in my secret account. I'd documented dozens of examples of family favoritism and Cameron's continued privileged treatment. And most importantly, I'd developed a clear timeline for my exit strategy. I would apply for early admission to several colleges with strong financial aid programs. I would petition for emancipation if necessary, and when the time was right, I would present my family with the evidence of their treatment and Cameron's confession, not to seek justice or apology, but to explain why I was leaving. But first, I wanted to give them one final chance to see who they were dealing with. The opportunity came in November during parent-teacher conferences. Dad and Mom were scheduled to meet with all of Cameron's teachers to discuss his senior year progress and college readiness. They were also scheduled to meet with my teachers, though I suspected those meetings would be perfunctory at best. What they didn't know was that I'd arranged something special for my conference. I'd asked my English teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, if I could present a creative writing project during the parent meeting. I told her I'd been working on a piece about family dynamics and wanted to share it with my parents as a surprise. Mrs. Rodriguez was delighted. She'd been impressed with my writing all semester and thought it would be wonderful for my parents to see my work.
The piece I'd written was titled The Invisible Daughter, a Study in Documented Favoritism. It was a carefully crafted narrative that told the story of my family through the lens of objective observation, supported by specific examples and, in some cases, direct quotes from my recordings. I didn't plan to accuse or attack. I planned to present facts and let them speak for themselves. But more than that, I planned to reveal exactly who they'd been underestimating all these months. The quiet, compliant daughter they thought they knew was about to show them what she'd really been doing with all that silence. The conference was scheduled for the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. By the time my parents walked out of that meeting, they would understand that everything in our family was about to change. And this time, I would be the one in control of the narrative. The Tuesday before Thanksgiving arrived with an unseasonable warmth that felt almost mocking. I'd barely slept the night before, running through my presentation one final time, checking that my phone was fully charged and my backup recordings were accessible. Everything I'd worked toward for the past 4 months was about to culminate in a single 20-minute meeting. I arrived at school early that morning, wanting to set up the classroom exactly how I needed it. Mrs. Rodriguez had given me permission to use the projector and sound system for my creative presentation, though she had no idea what she was actually enabling. "I'm so excited for your parents to see this piece, Elena," she said as I tested the audio equipment. "Your writing has been exceptional this semester. This family dynamics project really showcases your analytical skills." If she only knew. The conferences were scheduled throughout the day, with Cameron's meetings in the morning and mine in the afternoon. I deliberately requested the 3:30 p.m. slot, the last appointment of the day, to ensure we wouldn't be rushed and that the hallways would be mostly empty for what I expected to be a rather dramatic conclusion. During lunch, I saw Cameron in the cafeteria laughing with his friends about something on his phone. He looked relaxed, confident, completely unaware that his world was about to shift dramatically. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then I remembered the months of work I'd lost, the savings that had been stolen from me, the casual cruelty of using my destroyed property as a diversion tactic. My sympathy evaporated. At 3:15, I made my way to Mrs. Rodriguez's classroom and did a final equipment check. My presentation was loaded and ready. My phone was set to record the entire interaction. The printed documentation was organized in a folder on the desk. I heard their voices in the hallway before I saw them. Dad's authoritative tone discussing Cameron's college application timeline with Mom's occasional worried interjections. They sounded tired, probably worn out from a full day of teacher meetings about their golden boy's senior year progress. "Elena's meeting should be quick," I heard Dad say as they approached the classroom. "She's always been self-sufficient academically." They entered the room with polite smiles for Mrs. Rodriguez, who greeted them warmly and gestured toward the desks arranged in a small circle near the front of the room. "Thank you so much for coming," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "Elena has been doing exceptional work this semester. Her analytical writing has really impressed me." "That's wonderful to hear," Mom replied, settling into her chair. Dad checked his watch, a gesture I'd seen countless times when he was eager to finish an obligation and move on to something more important.
Actually, Mrs. Rodriguez continued, Elena has prepared a special presentation for you today. She's been working on a creative writing project about family dynamics, and she wanted to share it with you personally. Dad's eyebrows rose slightly. This clearly wasn't what he had expected from a routine parent-teacher conference. That's nice, he said carefully, though we do have dinner reservations at 4:30. This won't take long, I said, speaking for the first time since they'd arrived. But I think you'll find it very illuminating. I moved to the front of the classroom and started the projector. The title slide appeared on the smartboard. The Invisible Daughter, a study in documented favoritism. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Elena, Dad said, his voice carrying a warning tone, exactly what is this? It's a research project, I replied calmly. Mrs. Rodriguez assigned us to write about family dynamics using specific examples and evidence. I chose to focus on patterns of treatment and resource allocation in my own household. Mom shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Sweetheart, this seems a bit personal for a school presentation. The best writing comes from personal experience, Mrs. Rodriguez interjected, clearly sensing tension, but not understanding its source. Elena's analytical approach has been quite sophisticated. I clicked to the next slide. Methodology, documentation, and audio evidence. Dad's face went pale. Audio evidence? I've been recording family conversations for the past 4 months, with particular attention to comparative treatment patterns and resource allocation decisions. You've been recording us? Mom's voice was barely above a whisper. In common areas of the house, yes. Nothing illegal or unethical, just documenting interactions for research purposes. I clicked to the next slide. Case Study 1, the bicycle incident, initial investigation. What followed was a methodical presentation of everything I'd discovered and documented. I showed them the timeline of events surrounding my bike's destruction, the inconsistencies in Cameron's story, and the physical evidence I had found at Riverside Creek. Dad tried to interrupt several times, but I continued speaking calmly and professionally, treating this like the academic presentation it was supposed to be.
The evidence strongly suggested that the destruction was intentional rather than accidental, I continued, but I needed additional proof to confirm this hypothesis. I clicked to the next slide. Audio evidence, confession. Elena, that's enough, Dad said firmly. Turn this off right now. Let me just play this one recording, I said, my finger hovering over the play button. It's quite relevant to the case study. Before he could stop me, I pressed play. Cameron's voice filled the classroom, clear and unmistakable. Look, the bike thing worked, didn't it? Elena stopped bothering you about grades and college stuff for weeks after that happened. Then Dad's voice. What do you mean the bike thing worked? You were so stressed about my grades and the college applications, and I thought if there was some other drama to deal with. I paused the recording. The silence in the room was deafening. Mrs. Rodriguez was staring at the speaker in shock. Mom had her hand over her mouth. Dad looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. Shall I continue? I asked politely. There's quite a bit more, including the part where Cameron admits he maybe wasn't trying as hard as he could have to avoid the creek. Turn it off, Dad said, his voice barely controlled. And your response to this confession is particularly interesting. Would you like to hear how you handled learning that Cameron had deliberately destroyed my property as a manipulation tactic? Elena, stop this immediately. I clicked to the next slide. Comparative resource allocation. What appeared was a detailed chart showing every financial expenditure on Cameron versus me over the past year. His gaming equipment, SAT prep course, new laptop, car insurance, spending money, all meticulously documented and totaled. Next to it, my column showed babysitting income, the money taken for Cameron's debt, and my denied requests for basic needs. As you can see,
I said in the same calm, analytical tone. There's been a significant disparity in investment priorities. This is enough, Dad said, standing up. We're leaving. But we haven't gotten to the best part yet, I said, clicking to the next slide. Financial independence and future planning. The slide showed a bank statement, my secret account with its growing balance that was now approaching $1,500. You see, while you were busy reallocating my savings to cover Cameron's mistakes, I was building my own financial foundation. Turns out, when you're motivated by the need to escape an unfair situation, you become remarkably resourceful. Mom was staring at the screen in disbelief. Elena, where did this money come from? Freelance work, pet sitting, tutoring, odd jobs, all the things I've been doing while you assumed I was just sulking about my bike. I clicked to the next slide, which brings us to the real purpose of today's presentation. The final slide was titled Emancipation Documentation and College Early Admission Status. I've been accepted to 3 colleges with full scholarship packages. I can start as early as next semester if I choose to. I've also researched the legal requirements for emancipation and have documented sufficient evidence of financial independence and, shall we say, family dysfunction. The room was completely silent except for the hum of the projector. The point of this presentation, I continued, isn't to embarrass anyone or seek revenge. It's to demonstrate that the quiet, compliant daughter you thought you knew has actually been building a completely independent life while you weren't paying attention. I turned off the projector and faced my parents directly. For 15 years, I tried to earn a place in this family. I worked harder, complained less, and accepted unfair treatment because I thought if I just proved my worth, eventually I'd matter as much as Cameron. But what I learned is that no amount of achievement, responsibility, or sacrifice would ever change how you see me. Dad opened his mouth to speak, but I held up my hand. Cameron can steal an $800 tool and get sympathy and help fixing the problem, but when he deliberately destroys my $300 bike as a manipulation tactic, I'm told to accept it as wear and tear and move on. Cameron can fail classes and get expensive tutoring. I can excel academically and be told that a $60 photography class isn't in the budget. My voice remained steady, but I could feel years of suppressed emotion behind every word. The most telling thing isn't even the favoritism itself. It's how invisible you made it seem. You genuinely believed you were being fair because you'd convinced yourselves that I didn't want or need the same level of investment. But I documented everything. I have audio proof of dozens of conversations where my needs were dismissed while Cameron's wants were prioritized. Mrs. Rodriguez was looking between us with growing understanding and discomfort. This was clearly way beyond what she had expected from a student presentation. So, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to finish the semester, and then I'm leaving. I have the financial resources, the academic credentials, and the legal documentation to make that happen. This isn't a threat or a tantrum. It's simply information. Dad finally found his voice. Elena, you're being dramatic. We can work through whatever issues you think exist. I don't think these issues exist, Dad. I've proven they exist, with timestamps and audio evidence and financial records. And I picked up my folder of documentation. And the reason I'm telling you this now in this setting is so there's an independent witness to this conversation. I turned to Mrs. Rodriguez. I'm sorry to put you in this position, but I wanted someone objective present when I explained my decision to my parents.
Mrs. Rodriguez nodded slowly, clearly struggling to process everything she'd just witnessed. Elena, this is very serious. Maybe there should be some family counseling involved before any major decisions are made. With respect, Mrs. Rodriguez, I've spent 4 months documenting and analyzing this family's dynamics. I don't need counseling to understand the situation. I need distance from it. I looked back at my parents. Mom was crying quietly. Dad looked stunned and angry in equal measure. I'm not doing this to hurt you, I said, my voice softening slightly. I'm doing this because I finally understand that I can't fix a dynamic that's been 15 years in the making. Cameron will always be the priority. His problems will always become family emergencies that require my sacrifices. And I'll always be the one expected to understand, accept, and accommodate. That's not true, Mom said through her tears. We love you just as much as Cameron. Maybe you do, but you don't show it the same way. You don't invest in me the same way. You don't protect me the same way. And when push comes to shove, my needs get sacrificed for his wants every single time. I gathered my materials and headed toward the door. Elena, wait, Dad called. We need to discuss this as a family. No, we don't, I said, turning back one final time. I've said everything I needed to say. You have all the information you need to understand why I'm making this choice. What you do with that information is up to you. I paused at the doorway. Oh, and Dad, I'll be keeping my savings account, obviously. I think we've established that my money being treated as family money was part of the problem, not part of the solution. I walked out of the classroom, leaving my parents sitting in stunned silence with Mrs. Rodriguez, who was clearly questioning every assumption she had about parent-teacher conferences. The hallway was empty and quiet, my footsteps echoing as I made my way to the exit. For the first time in months, I felt free. Not happy exactly, but liberated from the exhausting cycle of hoping for fairness that would never come. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. How'd it go? I typed back, it's done. I'll call you tonight. I didn't go home immediately. Instead, I drove Rachel's borrowed car to Clearwater Park and sat by the creek where this whole journey had begun. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the water. In a few hours, I knew, my parents would arrive home and have to figure out how to explain to Cameron what had just happened. They'd have to confront the reality of the audio recordings, the documented favoritism, and the fact that their quiet, responsible daughter had been systematically building an escape plan for months. But that was their problem to solve now. I was done carrying the emotional labor of this family's dysfunction. My phone rang. It was Mom. Elena, please come home so we can talk about this. There's nothing to talk about, Mom. I've made my decision. You can't just leave your family over a misunderstanding. It's not a misunderstanding. It's a pattern that I've documented extensively. And I'm not leaving over it. I'm leaving because of it. What about Cameron? He's your brother. He loves you. I thought about that for a moment. Maybe he does, but he loves himself more. And you and Dad have taught him that his comfort is more important than my dignity. His convenience more valuable than my hard work. I can't change that dynamic, but I don't have to live with it either. There was a long pause. Elena, we can do better. We can change. I hope you do, I said sincerely. For Cameron's sake, I hope you teach him that actions have consequences and that other people's feelings matter. But I'm not going to be his practice dummy anymore while he learns those lessons. After I hung up, I sat by the creek until the sun began to set. Tomorrow, I'd start the formal process of early college admission. I'd finalize my emancipation paperwork. I'd begin the practical work of becoming fully independent. But tonight, for the first time in my life, I wasn't planning for someone else's approval or trying to avoid someone else's disappointment. I was planning for me. 3 months later, I was settled into my dorm room at Penn State with a full academic scholarship. I'd chosen to start the spring semester rather than wait for fall, eager to begin this new chapter of my life. Cameron had graduated high school and been accepted to a decent college, though not the prestigious university he'd originally hoped for.
Dad had been forced to take out significant loans to cover the tuition that Cameron's mediocre grades hadn't earned in scholarship money. The irony wasn't lost on me that my excellent academic record had earned me a free education, while Cameron's privileged treatment had left the family struggling financially. We'd had minimal contact since that day in Mrs. Rodriguez's classroom. A few awkward text exchanges, one stilted phone call, a brief encounter when I came to collect my belongings. The conversations were polite but distant, like interactions between strangers who happened to share a history. I didn't hate them. I wasn't even angry anymore. I'd simply moved beyond needing their validation or fearing their disapproval. Sometimes, I wondered if they had learned anything from my departure, if Cameron had faced any real consequences for his manipulative behavior, if Dad had recognized the damage his favoritism had caused, if Mom had found her voice and started advocating for fairness. But mostly, I didn't think about them at all. I was too busy building the life I'd always wanted, one where my worth wasn't determined by comparison to someone else, where my achievements weren't minimized or ignored, where my voice mattered as much as anyone else's. I kept the recordings, not out of spite, but as a reminder. Whenever I doubted myself or wondered if I'd overreacted, I could listen to the evidence of who I had been in that family versus who I was becoming on my own. The girl who had once begged for scraps of attention had become a woman who knew her own value. The daughter who was treated as disposable had built a life where she was indispensable to herself. And sometimes, when I was riding my new bike through the campus trails, I'd remember that 15-year-old girl whose property had been destroyed and whose pain had been dismissed. I'd think about how that moment of injustice had ultimately set her free. Because in trying to break her spirit, my family had actually forged it into something unbreakable. And for that, I was almost grateful.